Deep within the nightmare realm of Mensis, in corridors that twist and fold upon themselves like the fevered dreams of a madman, walks a figure clad in tattered robes. Upon his head sits a cage of iron, a grotesque antenna meant to pierce the veil between worlds. His laughter echoes through empty halls, manic and hollow, the sound of a mind that has gazed too long into the abyss and found comfort in its depths. This is Mikolash, host of the nightmare, and his story is one of the darkest that Bloodborne has to tell. For while other characters in this gothic nightmare may have fallen to circumstance, to transformation, to tragic fate, Mikolash chose his path with full knowledge of the horrors it would unleash. He may not have created the scourge itself, but his actions significantly worsened its effects, and the suffering he caused reverberates through every corner of Yharnam, a testament to what happens when ambition strips away the last vestiges of humanity. The man behind the cage. Before we can understand the monster, we must understand the man. Mikolash was not always the cackling wraith who haunts the nightmare of Mensis. Once he was a scholar, a student of Byrgenwerth, that prestigious college where the brightest minds of the age gathered to unlock the secrets of the cosmos. He wore the student uniform with its graduation cape, marking him as one who had completed his studies under the watchful eye of Master Willem himself. The provost of Byrgenwerth was a man obsessed with a singular idea that echoed through the halls of that lakeside institution. We are thinking on the basest of planes. What we need are more eyes. This philosophy would shape Mikolash in ways that Master Willem could never have anticipated. Where Willem sought enlightenment through contemplation and careful study, where he warned his students to fear the old blood, Mikolash heard only the promise of transcendence. He was one of many who would leave Byrgenwerth, disillusioned with Willem's cautious approach, seeking faster, darker paths to the truth they all craved. But unlike Lawrence, who founded the healing church and at least maintained some semblance of helping humanity even as he damned it, Mikolash had no such pretensions. His goal was singular, selfish, and all-consuming: to commune with the Great Ones and ascend beyond the limitations of human existence. We know little of Mikolash's personality before his descent into madness, but certain details suggest a picture. He was clearly charismatic enough to gather followers, to convince an entire school of scholars to follow him down his twisted path. The School of Mensis was no small operation. It required resources, secrecy, and unwavering devotion from its members. This implies Mikolash possessed the kind of fervent belief that could sweep others along in his wake. Whether there was a time when he genuinely believed he was serving a greater good, when he told himself that the sacrifices would be worth the knowledge gained, we cannot know for certain. If such a time existed, it lies buried beneath layers of obsession and madness. What we see in the game is a man who has long since crossed any moral boundary that might have once constrained him. When we encounter his mummified corpse in Yahar'gul, seated in a chair beneath a beam of pale moonlight, surrounded by the desiccated remains of his fellow scholars, we see the price of his ambition. His physical body has been dead for some time, yet his consciousness persists in the nightmare he created. This was no accident. Mikolash deliberately sent his mind into that realm, abandoning his flesh in pursuit of communion with forces beyond human comprehension. But the body left behind tells its own story of the ritual that killed him and everyone foolish enough to follow. The Mensis cage he wears is perhaps the most iconic element of his appearance, an iron framework that encases his entire head. According to the item description, these cages were designed to isolate the will of the individual to see the world for what it really is, and to act as a conduit for the Great Ones. Whether this device actually functioned as intended is debatable, but its symbolism is clear. Mikolash imprisoned his own thoughts, constrained his perception through a literal cage in hopes of achieving something greater. The scholars of Mensis believed these contraptions would protect their minds from the eldritch truth, while simultaneously allowing them to perceive it. The irony is palpable. In trying to protect their sanity, they ensured its destruction. Looking at Mikolash's skeletal remains, we can see that his cage is larger than those worn by his fellow scholars, adorned with more intricate metalwork. This was no mass-produced tool, but a custom piece, befitting the leader of the school. Even in death, even reduced to bones and withered flesh, Mikolash maintained this symbol of his authority and his madness. The cage has become inseparable from his identity, so much so that when his consciousness manifests in the nightmare, he wears it still. It has become part of him, a physical manifestation of how thoroughly he has imprisoned himself in his own obsession. The nightmare version of Micolash that hunters encounter is oddly jovial, almost playful, as he runs through the corridors of Murgo's loft. He cackles and taunts, calls out prayers to Kos or Cosm, speaks of the cosmos with reverent fervor. There's something deeply unsettling about his demeanor, a disconnect between the horror of what he's done and the almost childlike enthusiasm with which he discusses it. "Ah, Kos, or some say Cosm, do you hear our prayers?" he calls out, his voice echoing through the nightmare. Grant us eyes, plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy." These words, delivered with such passion, reveal the core of Mikolash's being. He genuinely believes in what he's doing, sees himself as transcending human limitations rather than abandoning human decency. But beneath the manic energy, there are moments where cracks show. When reduced to half health during his boss fight, he cries out, "Majestic! A hunter is a hunter, even in a dream." There's almost admiration in his voice, a recognition that he's being challenged by something equal to himself. Later, as death claims his consciousness, his final words carry uncertainty. Different translations render it as either, "Now, I'm waking up, I'll forget everything," or, "Will I wake up? Will I forget everything?" These aren't the words of triumph, but of sudden, horrible doubt. After everything he sacrificed, everyone he killed, Mikolash faces his end wondering if he may have been wrong, if death in the nightmare means true death, and if all the knowledge he sought will slip away like a fading dream. The origins at Byrgenwerth and the pursuit of eyes. To understand how Mikolash became the monster he is, we must return to where it all began, Byrgenwerth. This venerable institution stood as a beacon of learning in a world hungry for knowledge. Under the stewardship of Master Willem, Byrgenwerth scholars delved into mysteries that most would never dare approach. They were archaeologists of the impossible, explorers of realms beyond human comprehension. Through their expeditions into the ancient labyrinths beneath Yharnam, they uncovered the tombs of the Pthumerians, and more importantly, they discovered evidence of the Great Ones. These beings, sometimes called gods, existed on a plane far removed from human understanding. They were not gods in any traditional sense, but rather entities whose very existence transcended the physical laws that governed humanity. The Great Ones commanded powers that appeared magical or divine to human eyes, but which might simply have been the natural expression of beings who operated according to different rules entirely. The discovery of these entities sparked a fervent debate among Byrgenwerth scholars. Could humanity reach that level of existence? Could humans transcend their current form and join the Great Ones on their higher plane? Master Willem believed it was possible, but only through the cultivation of insight and knowledge. His famous epiphany became the guiding principle of Byrgenwerth's research. He sought to line his brain with eyes, to expand human consciousness through pure intellectual and spiritual growth. He was deeply opposed to using the old blood, that mysterious vital fluid found in the bodies of Great Ones and their kin. "Fear the old blood," he warned his students, sensing the danger in trying to force evolution through physical means. But Willem's student Lawrence disagreed. When Byrgenwerth's expeditions uncovered the old blood, Lawrence saw not danger but opportunity. The blood seemed to possess miraculous healing properties, capable of curing any illness and granting strength beyond normal human limits. Lawrence believed that blood was the key to human ascension, and he was willing to abandon his master's teachings to prove it. The schism between Willem and Lawrence led to the founding of the Healing Church, an institution that would come to dominate Yharnam and set in motion the events that would eventually doom the city. Mikolash witnessed this divide firsthand. He saw his fellow student leave Byrgenwerth to found an institution that would use the old blood freely, ministering it to the sick and spreading its use throughout Yharnam. He also saw Master Willem's response: withdrawal, isolation, a retreat into pure contemplation that seemed to achieve little tangible result. By the time hunters encounter Willem in the game, he has become a withered figure, barely able to speak, sitting in his rocking chair and simply pointing toward the lake where Ram hides. Whatever ascension Willem sought, it had not manifested in any obvious way. For someone like Mikolash, hungry for results, for concrete proof of transcendence. Both approaches must have seemed inadequate. Willem was too cautious, too willing to merely observe and ponder. Lawrence was too focused on the physical, on blood ministration and curing disease, when the true goal should be communion with the great ones themselves. Micolash saw a third path, one that would combine the intellectual rigor of Byrgenwerth with a willingness to experiment that would make even the healing church uncomfortable. He would not fear the blood, but neither would he be limited by it. He would use any means necessary, any sacrifice required, to achieve direct contact with the great ones. The specific moment when Micolash left Byrgenwerth is not recorded in the game's lore. Based on what we know of the timeline, it seems likely this happened relatively early, possibly around the same period when Lawrence founded the Healing Church. Micolash may have initially been part of the church's hierarchy, as the School of Mensis is described as one of the higher echelons of the Healing Church, alongside the choir, but where the choir sought communion with great ones through cultivation of lumen flowers and careful study of Abridas, daughter of the cosmos. Micolash pursued grander, darker ambitions. The philosophy he developed was clear. Humans needed more eyes to perceive truth, as Master Willem said, but they needed to go further. They needed to be granted eyes by the great ones themselves, to have eyes planted directly into their brains through divine intervention. This wasn't about patient study or careful cultivation of insight. This was about forcing direct contact, about demanding that the great ones notice humanity and bestow their gift. And if that contact required rituals that most would consider blasphemous, if it required sacrifices that would horrify ordinary people, well, those were merely necessary steps on the path to enlightenment. Mikolash's interpretation of Byrgenwerth's teachings appears to have been corrupted by his impatience and his arrogance. Where Willem likely spoke of eyes as a metaphor for perception, for expanding consciousness through knowledge and insight, Micolash seems to have taken it more literally. He became obsessed with physical eyes, with harvesting them, with somehow acquiring enough of them to please the great ones. Whether this literal-minded approach represents a genuine misunderstanding of Willem's philosophical teachings, or simply an opportunity to justify what he wanted to do anyway, wrapping it in the language of Byrgenwerth's wisdom, to give his actions a veneer of scholarly purpose, remains unclear. The other students who became part of Byrgenwerth's scholarly tradition offer interesting points of comparison. Lawrence, for all his faults, genuinely seems to have wanted to help people, even if his methods led to disaster. The researchers of the choir experimented on orphans, which was horrific, but they at least seem to have believed they were pursuing transcendence for all humanity, not just themselves. Even imposter Iosefka, conducting her cruel experiments on patients, appears to have been motivated by a twisted desire to advance human evolution. Micolash stands apart from all of them because his ultimate goal was entirely selfish. He wanted to commune with the great ones for his own enlightenment, to satisfy his own curiosity, to achieve his own transcendence. The School of Mensis wasn't about helping humanity evolve. It was about Micolash getting answers to his questions, about feeding his insatiable hunger for knowledge, regardless of the cost to anyone else. Every person who died in service of his experiments, every innocent kidnapped from Yharnam's streets, every scholar who followed him into the nightmare, they were all just fuel for his ambition. The School of Mensis and its dark philosophy. The School of Mensis emerged as a distinct faction within the upper echelons of the Healing Church, but its true nature was far removed from the church's public face, where the church presented itself as a benevolent institution dedicated to healing and helping the people of Yharnam. The School of Mensis operated in the shadows, pursuing goals that would have horrified ordinary citizens. The school's name itself is revealing. Mensis is Latin for month, but it also carries associations with menstruation, blood cycles, and birth. These themes of blood and birth were central to the Great One's nature, for as the lore tells us, every Great One loses its child and then yearns for a surrogate. Micolash established the school's headquarters in Yahar'gul, the unseen village, a location carefully hidden from Yharnam's ordinary residents. This wasn't simply a matter of discretion. Yahar'gul was deliberately concealed, removed from the sight of the Healing Church's lower ranks and the general populace. The village itself became a laboratory, a place where Mikolash and his scholars could conduct their experiments without interference or oversight. What the residents of Yahar'gul knew of these activities, and whether they participated willingly or were simply trapped in a village controlled by the School of Mensis, remains unclear from the game's lore. The philosophy of the School of Mensis was built on several key principles, all of them corrupted versions of Byrgenwerth's original teachings. First, they believed that humans could achieve ascension through communion with the Great Ones, but unlike Master Willem, they were not content to wait patiently for enlightenment. They would force contact through ritual and sacrifice. Second, they believed that the path to the Great Ones lay through the nightmare realms, those twisted reflections of reality where the Great Ones dwelled. To reach these beings, one had to be willing to abandon the waking world entirely. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they believed that the ends justified any means. If communion with the Great Ones required human sacrifice, so be it. If it meant kidnapping innocents from Yharnam streets, transforming them into monsters, harvesting their organs for ritual use, these were acceptable costs. The School of Mensis had no ethical boundaries because they had convinced themselves they were pursuing something far more important than individual human lives. They were seeking truth, enlightenment, transcendence. What were a few hundred deaths, or a few thousand, compared to the knowledge they might gain? The structure of the school reflected these priorities. Mikolash served as its undisputed leader, the host who would guide them to communion with the Great Ones. Below him were other scholars, all wearing the distinctive Mensis cages that marked them as members of this secretive order. These cages were not optional equipment but mandatory, a sign of their commitment to the school's goals. By imprisoning their own thoughts within these iron frameworks, they believed they could better withstand the eldritch truth they sought to perceive. Supporting the scholars were various operatives and servants. The kidnappers, those hulking figures with their distinctive sacks, were agents of the school dispatched into Yharnam proper to acquire test subjects. These weren't random criminals or thugs hired for the task. They appear to have been deliberately transformed into their current state, given enhanced strength and durability to better perform their grim duty. The transformation probably involved extensive exposure to the old blood or other experimental procedures, turning them into something more than human but less than kin. The school also commanded the services of various hunters. The Yahar'gul hunters we encounter in the game, dressed in distinctive black attire and wielding an array of weapons, were loyal to Mikolash's cause. Unlike the hunters of the Healing Church's standard workshops, these individuals had aligned themselves specifically with the School of Mensis and its goals. They protected the rituals, guarded Yahar'gul's secrets, and presumably dealt with anyone who got too close to discovering what the school was doing. Perhaps most disturbing was the school's relationship with the Thumerian Chime Maidens. These ancient beings, remnants of that civilization which had first discovered the old blood and fallen into ruin, somehow became allied with or bound to the School of Mensis. The Chime Maidens possessed the ability to summon other creatures and to call forth abominations from the nightmare realms. Their presence in Yahar'gul suggests that Mikolash had somehow established contact with them, likely through his explorations of the ancient labyrinths beneath Yharnam, though exactly how he convinced or compelled them to serve his purposes remains a mystery. The day-to-day operations of the school were horrifying in their banality. Research continued around the clock. Experiments were conducted with cold precision, and the results were meticulously documented. The scholars of Mensis were not mere madmen conducting random atrocities. They were methodical, organized, pursuing their goals with scientific rigor, even as the nature of those goals grew increasingly dark. Notes found throughout Yahar'gul speak of nightmarish rituals and beckoning the moon, of experiments designed to grant audience with powers beyond human comprehension. One particularly revealing note states, "Nightmarish rituals crave a newborn. Find one and silence its harrowing cry." This single sentence encapsulates so much of what made the School of Mensis evil. Infants were not seen as innocent lives to be protected, but as ritual components, as lures to attract the attention of great ones. The casual nature of the instruction, the matter-of-fact way it discusses kidnapping and presumably murdering a baby, speaks to how thoroughly the school's members had abandoned their humanity. They had become so focused on their goal that they could no longer see the horror of what they were doing. Another note reads, "Madmen toil surreptitiously in rituals to beckon the moon." The use of madmen is telling. Even those writing these notes recognized that what they were doing was insane, but they persisted anyway. The promise of knowledge, the possibility of communion with the Great Ones, was too intoxicating to resist. They knew they were mad, and they embraced it. The school's research took many forms, but several projects stand out for their ambition and their cruelty. They studied the properties of blood, not to cure disease like the healing church, but to understand how it could be used to bridge the gap between the waking world and the nightmare. They experimented with eyes, both physical and metaphorical, seeking ways to perceive things beyond normal human sight. They explored the nature of the ancient labyrinths and the secrets held within, uncovering knowledge that had been deliberately buried by the Pthumerians. Most significantly, they researched the Great Ones themselves, studying every scrap of information they could find about these beings. They learned about Kos, the Great One whose corpse washed up on the shores of the fishing hamlet, and whose death brought a curse upon the hunters who killed her. They learned about Eden, the formless Great One who existed only as voice and presence. They learned about Murgo, the stillborn child of Queen Yharnam and some Great One, whose cry echoed through the nightmare realms. It was this last piece of knowledge that would prove most crucial. Murgo represented an opportunity, a Great One who was still accessible despite being dead or stillborn in the physical world. If the School of Mensis could establish contact with Murgo, if they could gain audience with this entity, perhaps they could finally achieve the communion they sought. But to reach Murgo, they would need to conduct a ritual of unprecedented scope and power, one that would require the sacrifice of not just individuals but potentially the entire population of Yahar'gul. The scholars understood the risks. They knew that what they were attempting had never been successfully done before, that they were venturing into territory where even the Pthumerians had feared to tread. But they also believed they had prepared as well as possible. They had the Mensis cages to protect their minds. They had the knowledge accumulated from decades of study. They had the third umbilical cord, that relic of the Great Ones which could facilitate contact with higher planes. They had everything they needed, or so they thought. What they didn't have was wisdom. They didn't have the moral grounding that might have made them pause and consider whether their goal was worth the cost. They didn't have the self-awareness to recognize that they were no longer scholars seeking truth but fanatics pursuing obsession. And they certainly didn't have any real understanding of what they would be unleashing if they succeeded. The Great Ones were not benevolent entities waiting to share their wisdom with worthy humans. They were alien, incomprehensible, operating according to rules and desires that had nothing to do with human welfare. But Mikolash was committed to his path. He had gathered his followers, established his base of operations, and conducted his preliminary research. Now it was time for the grand ritual, the Mensis Ritual that would beckon the moon and grant them audience with Murgo. It was time to show Master Willem and Lawrence and all the other scholars who had doubted him that he had found the true path to enlightenment. It was time for the School of Mensis to write its name in history, though the ink they would use was blood, and the page they would write upon was the destruction of an entire village. Yahar'gul, the unseen village of horrors. Yahar'gul stands as a monument to the School of Mensis's crimes, a village that was transformed from a hidden community into a charnel house of eldritch experimentation. The very name Unseen Village speaks to its nature. This was not simply a place that happened to be hidden from Yharnam. It was deliberately concealed, removed from the sight of the healing church's lower ranks and ordinary citizens. The village existed in a state of enforced secrecy, accessible only to those who knew the hidden paths or who were dragged there by the kidnappers against their will. The geography of Yahar'gul reflects its dark purpose. Winding streets lined with buildings that seem to lean in upon themselves, creating a claustrophobic maze of stone and shadow. Massive structures tower over narrow alleyways, their architecture suggesting both great antiquity and disturbing purpose. The village was built, or at least extensively modified, to serve the needs of the School of Mensis. Every element of its design speaks to control, to containment, to the conducting of activities that should never see the light of day. Throughout the village, we find evidence of the amygdala, those lesser Great Ones that appear as massive, spider-like creatures hanging from buildings and perched on rooftops. Their presence was not accidental. The School of Mensis had established some form of contact or arrangement with these beings, and the amygdala served as both guardians and perhaps as conduits for the eldritch energies the school sought to harness. Statues depicting amygdala can be found throughout Yahar'gul, suggesting that the village's inhabitants actively worshipped these creatures, or at least paid them reverence as intermediaries to the higher Great Ones. Before the Mensis ritual consumed it, Yahar'gul would have been a functioning community, albeit a deeply disturbing one. The residents went about their daily lives even as horrible experiments were conducted in the basements and hidden chambers around them. Some were probably true believers, fully committed to Mikolash's vision. Others may have simply been trapped, living in the village because they had nowhere else to go or because leaving would mean abandoning family members who were involved with the school. And of course, there were the victims, those who had been kidnapped from Yharnam and brought to Yahar'gul for experimentation. The kidnapping operation was systematic and extensive. After hunters defeat the blood-starved beast in Old Yharnam, the kidnappers begin appearing at various locations throughout Yharnam proper. These hulking figures, with their enormous sacks and disproportionate bodies, would target solitary individuals, particularly those wandering the streets after dark. When they killed their victims rather than simply knocking them unconscious, those poor souls would wake not in the hunter's dream, but in the Hypogean jail, the underground prison that served as Yahar'gul's intake facility. Imagine the terror of that awakening. You're walking home through the streets of Yharnam, perhaps returning from the Healing Church's blood ministration, when a massive figure emerges from the shadows. Before you can react, a crushing blow sends you into darkness. When consciousness returns, you're locked in a cage in a place you've never seen, surrounded by the sounds of other prisoners weeping and screaming. Strange figures in iron cages on their heads peer at you through the bars. You don't know where you are or why you were taken, only that escape seems impossible and that your future holds something too terrible to contemplate. This happened to countless Yharnam residents. Men, women, possibly even children, all dragged from their lives and imprisoned in Yahar'gul's depths. The school needed a constant supply of test subjects for their experiments. They were trying to understand how to force human evolution, how to create kin, how to establish the conditions necessary for communion with the Great Ones. Each prisoner represented another data point, another opportunity to refine their techniques. The experiments themselves varied in nature, but none were pleasant. Some prisoners appeared to have been exposed to massive amounts of old blood, their bodies forced to undergo rapid transformation in hopes of creating kin, or at least something approaching that state. Based on the creatures we encounter in Yahar'gul, the results were often grotesque failures, leaving subjects twisted and in agony, but not elevated in any meaningful way. Other experiments seem to have focused on the brain, attempts to artificially cultivate eyes on the cerebral cortex as Master Willem had described. Given the school's obsession with eyes and insight, it's likely these procedures were conducted while subjects were conscious, the better to observe the effects on perception and awareness. Still, other prisoners may have been kept alive to have their organs harvested. Notes mention control of Hemwick Charnel Lane, that fog-shrouded area filled with corpses and the witches who tended them. The connection between the School of Mensis and this location suggests they used the charnel lane as a source of raw materials for their rituals. Eyes were particularly prized, gathered in huge numbers given Mikolash's obsession with them, though the game never explicitly shows the harvesting process. But hearts, brains, blood, all of these likely held value for the school's blasphemous ceremonies. The treatment of these victims reveals much about how thoroughly Mikolash and his followers had abandoned their humanity. These were not anonymous test subjects or enemies of the state. These were ordinary people who had committed no crime except living in Yharnam. They had families, dreams, lives that were cut short because the School of Mensis decided they were more valuable as experimental materials than as human beings. And the scholars of Mensis conducted their experiments with clinical detachment, recording their observations and adjusting their procedures without any apparent guilt or remorse. The living conditions in the Hypogean jail were deliberately horrific. Prisoners were kept in cramped cages, barely large enough to sit in, with no sanitation and minimal food. The air would have been thick with the stench of sweat, excrement, and fear. Screams echoed through the stone corridors as experiments were conducted in nearby chambers. and hanging over everything was the certain knowledge that there would be no rescue, no escape, that this dark place would be where they died. Some prisoners went mad long before the experiments killed them. We find notes left by those who had lost all hope, scrawled messages that speak of despair and horror. Others maintained their sanity through sheer force of will, clinging to the memory of loved ones or the faint hope that somehow someone would come for them. But no one came. The Healing Church, if it even knew about Yahar'gul's activities, chose not to intervene. The hunters were too busy dealing with the beast's scourge to investigate rumors of disappearances. And ordinary citizens had no power to challenge an institution as entrenched as the School of Mensis. The village above the Hypogean jail was scarcely better. The Yahar'gul hunters patrolled the streets, ensuring that no one unauthorized could enter or leave. The chime maidens stood at key locations, their bells ready to summon reinforcements at the first sign of trouble. And everywhere, the sense that something was fundamentally wrong permeated the very stones of the buildings. Even before the Mensis Ritual destroyed it, Yahar'gul was a place of death and suffering, a village that had sold its soul in pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The architecture itself seems to have been modified to serve the ritual's needs. Strange basins placed at specific locations throughout the village appear designed to collect or focus arcane energies. The layout of the streets and buildings creates geometric patterns that likely had ritual significance. And at the heart of it all was the Advent Plaza, where the final stage of the ritual would be conducted, where bell maidens would summon the One Reborn, and where the population of Yahar'gul would pay the ultimate price for Mikolash's ambition. Looking at Yahar'gul now, after the blood moon has risen and the ritual has run its course, we see the true cost of the School of Mensis's work. The streets are lined with corpses, or rather, with people who are not quite corpses. They're fused to the walls and buildings, their bodies twisted into impossible shapes, faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. These were the residents of Yahar'gul, caught up in the ritual's power and transformed into monuments to suffering. Some of these unfortunate souls are still technically alive. They reach out with malformed limbs as hunters pass, making no sound but clearly aware of their torment. They're trapped in their own bodies, unable to die but also unable to live any meaningful existence. The ritual that was supposed to grant communion with the Great Ones instead turned them into permanent reminders of what happens when humans reach too far beyond their station. Yahar'gul stands as perhaps the clearest evidence of Mikolash's evil. This entire village became a sacrifice to his ambition. Every man, woman, and child who lived there transformed into fuel for his ritual. And the worst part is that he knew this would happen. The notes make it clear that the scholars understood their ritual would have catastrophic effects on the physical world. They proceeded anyway because they believed the knowledge they would gain was worth any price. That calculation, that cold arithmetic that weighs a village full of people against the abstract possibility of communion with the Great Ones, and finds the people wanting. That is the essence of evil. Not passion, not madness, not even cruelty for its own sake, but the deliberate choice to prioritize one's own goals over the lives and suffering of others. Mikolash looked at Yahar'gul, at all its residents, at the prisoners held in the Hypogean jail, and decided they were acceptable sacrifices. That decision, made with full knowledge and clear intent, is what makes him Bloodborne's most evil character. The Mensis Ritual and Beckoning the Moon. The Mensis Ritual stands as the culmination of Mikolash's work, the grand summation of everything the School of Mensis had researched and prepared for. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision or an experiment gone wrong. It was a carefully planned operation, designed with specific goals and executed with precision despite the catastrophic results it would produce. Understanding the ritual requires understanding what Mikolash was trying to achieve and what tools he had at his disposal to achieve it. The primary goal was simple in concept but staggering in ambition: to establish direct communion with Murgo, the stillborn Great One child of Queen Yharnam. Murgo existed in a state that defied normal understanding of life and death. The child had been stillborn in the physical world, yet its consciousness persisted in the nightmare realms, crying out with a voice that could be heard by those with sufficient insight. This cry was not meaningless. It was a beacon, a signal that the Great Ones could perceive, and that drew the blood moon closer to the waking world. To reach Murgo, Mikolash needed several key components. First and foremost was the third umbilical cord, that strange artifact described as a great relic, also known as the Cord of the Eye. These cords were remnants of the Great One's failed attempts at bearing children, and they possessed profound metaphysical properties. Master Willem had sought one to elevate his being and thoughts to those of a Great One, but the School of Mensis intended to use theirs more directly, as a kind of telephone line to contact Murgo specifically. The item description of the cord obtained after defeating Murgo's wet nurse is particularly revealing. Every Great One loses its child and then yearns for a surrogate. This cord granted Mensis audience with Murgo, but resulted in the stillbirth of their brains. That last phrase is crucial. The ritual succeeded in its primary goal, establishing contact with Murgo, but the nature of that contact was too much for human minds to endure. The scholars' brains were stillborn, destroyed by the eldritch knowledge they received, leaving them as little more than empty husks. The second component was the Mensis cages themselves. The scholars believed these iron frameworks would protect their minds during the communion, isolating their consciousness and allowing them to perceive the Great Ones without being driven instantly mad. This belief turned out to be tragically mistaken. The cages did something, perhaps even facilitated the contact, but they provided no meaningful protection from the consequences of that contact. The third component was moonlight itself, or rather, the pale moonlight that was somehow connected to the Great Ones and their power. Notes in Yahar'gul speak of madmen toiling surreptitiously in rituals to beckon the moon. The scholars were not merely observing the moon or studying it from afar. They were actively calling it closer, lowering the blood moon toward the earth in hopes that its proximity would facilitate communion with the entities that dwelled in the nightmare realms. The ritual was conducted at a specific time and place. The scholars of Mensis gathered in the Advent Plaza area, arranging themselves in formation with Mikolash at the center. They sat in chairs, heads tilted back to expose their caged faces to the moonlight streaming down from above. The Thumerian chime maidens took their positions around the perimeter, ready to perform their role in the ceremony. And then, as one, the scholars sent their consciousness into the nightmare, abandoning their physical bodies in a desperate bid to reach Murgo. What happened next can only be pieced together from the evidence left behind. We know the ritual succeeded in granting audience with Murgo because the item description explicitly states this. We also know that this contact resulted in the stillbirth of the scholars' brains, destroying their minds even as it granted them the knowledge they sought. Most of the scholars simply died, their consciousness snuffed out by forces they couldn't comprehend. Their bodies remained in their chairs, preserved by some property of the ritual, mummified husks that would remain in Yahar'gul long after the blood moon rose. But Mikolash was different. Whether through strength of will, some property of his larger and more elaborate Mensis cage, or simply because he was the ritual's focus, his consciousness survived the transition where others did not. He became what his title suggests, the host of the nightmare, anchoring the nightmare realm that Murgo inhabited and serving as a kind of living connection between the waking world and the dream. However, hosting the nightmare came with consequences that Mikolash may not have anticipated. He became trapped within it, unable to leave or even to truly die. His physical body expired along with the others, but his consciousness persisted, wandering the halls of Murgo's loft in a state that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. And while he achieved communion with Murgo, that communion did not grant him the transcendence he sought. He remained fundamentally human, trapped in a nightmare of his own creation, his mind slowly eroding as he spent eternity contemplating truths that were never meant for human comprehension. The ritual's effects extended far beyond the scholars who participated directly. The act of beckoning the blood moon closer to the waking world had catastrophic consequences for Yharnam and particularly for Yahar'gul. The heightened proximity of the moon created a situation where the barrier between the waking world and the nightmare became dangerously thin. This facilitated the scholars' contact with Murgo, but also allowed other, less desirable effects to manifest. The entire population of Yahar'gul was affected. Those residents who weren't directly involved in the ritual found themselves caught up in its power anyway. Their bodies were twisted and fused to the buildings, transformed into the horrifying sculptures we see throughout the village. The mechanism of this transformation is never explained in the game, though it appears to have been connected to the massive surge of eldritch power that accompanied the ritual. Reality itself seems to have warped in Yahar'gul, and human bodies were not resilient enough to maintain their shape under such conditions. The blood moon's proximity had effects throughout Yharnam as well. One of the most significant was its impact on the beast scourge. Those who had partaken of the old blood found their transformations accelerating, the beast within them coming to the fore with increased ferocity. The note that states when the red moon hangs low, the line between man and beast is blurred, captures this phenomenon perfectly. The moon's influence made the scourge significantly worse, turning Yharnam's streets into a war zone as beast transformations occurred more frequently and more violently. Another crucial effect was that the blood moon made the amygdala visible to those with even relatively low insight. Prior to this, these lesser great ones could only be perceived by individuals who had accumulated significant insight through exposure to eldritch truth. But with the moon hanging so low, almost anyone could see them, clinging to buildings and watching with their multitude of eyes. This revelation alone must have driven many Yharnam residents mad, suddenly being able to see these impossible creatures that had been there all along. The ritual also enabled the summoning of the One Reborn, though whether this was an intended result or an unforeseen consequence is unclear. The Chime Maidens who stood in the Advent Plaza called forth this massive, malformed creature, a writhing amalgamation of corpses and eldritch power. Some theories suggest that the One Reborn was meant to be a vessel for Murgo, an attempt to give physical form to the stillborn Great One. Others propose it was simply the natural result of so many deaths in one place, combined with the ritual's power. Whatever its origin, the One Reborn became a guardian of sorts, preventing anyone from reaching the site of the ritual and potentially disrupting whatever remained of the connection to Murgo. The ritual succeeded in its stated goal, but failed in every meaningful way. Mikolash gained audience with Murgo, but that audience destroyed his mind and trapped him in a nightmare. The scholars of Mensis achieved communion with a Great One, but they were annihilated in the process. They beckoned the blood moon, and it came, bringing with it chaos and transformation that devastated Yharnam. Every single objective they accomplished came with a cost far greater than the benefit received. And yet, from his perspective within the nightmare, Mikolash might consider it all worthwhile. He speaks with fervor about the knowledge he's gained, about the eyes he's been granted, about the privilege of communing with higher beings. Grant us eyes, plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy, he prays, still seeking more even after everything he's already received. His madness is complete, his obsession total. He cannot or will not recognize that he has destroyed everything in pursuit of something that was never worth having in the first place. Murgo and the nightmare's creation. At the heart of the Mensis Ritual lies Murgo, perhaps the most tragic figure in all of Bloodborne's lore. An infant Great One, stillborn before ever drawing breath in the physical world. Murgo exists in a state that defies conventional understanding of life and death. The child is the offspring of Queen Yharnam, the last queen of the ancient Thumerian civilization, and Eden, the formless Great One who exists only as voice and influence. This union produced a child that was doomed from the start, for as the lore repeatedly tells us, every Great One loses its child and then yearns for a surrogate. The circumstances of Murgo's stillbirth are not fully detailed in the game, but we can infer certain things from the evidence available. Queen Yharnam appears throughout the game looking perpetually pregnant, her dress stained with blood, her posture one of grief and loss. The Yharnam stone she drops when defeated in the Chalice dungeons mentions the oblation and shadowy deaths that befell the Thumerians, suggesting that something catastrophic happened during Murgo's birth. Perhaps the child was poisoned by the old blood that had corrupted Thumerian society. Perhaps Eden's formless nature meant his offspring could not maintain physical form. Or perhaps the very fact of being born to a human mother, even a Thumerian queen, doomed the child to die. Whatever the cause, Murgo appears to have perished in the waking world, but did not cease to exist entirely. The child's consciousness, its spirit or essence or whatever term we use for the immaterial aspect of a Great One, seems to have persisted in the nightmare realms. There, In a space that was neither fully real nor completely imagined, Murgo continued to cry, a sound that echoed across the boundaries between worlds. This cry was significant. It was the voice of a great one, a being whose very existence warped reality around it, and it drew the blood moon closer with every wail. The nightmare that Murgo inhabited was not a place in any conventional sense. It was a realm of consciousness, a space constructed from dreams and fears and the incomprehensible thoughts of beings beyond human understanding. Within this nightmare stood Murgo's loft, a cathedral-like structure that served as the child's nursery. And there, at the very top of the loft, sat a pram, a baby's carriage that should have held Murgo's physical form, but which remained empty because the child had no body to occupy it. Guarding this pram was Murgo's wet nurse, a towering figure draped in black robes and wielding multiple blades. The wet nurse is described as a great one itself, though its exact nature and origin remain mysterious. In human terms, a wet nurse is someone employed to feed and care for another's child, and this entity appears to serve a similar role for Murgo. But what does it mean to care for a stillborn great one? What sustenance does a being without physical form require? These questions have no clear answers, but the wet nurse's protective behavior suggests that Murgo, despite being dead in the physical sense, was precious and required defending. The School of Mensis learned of Murgo through their research into the Pthumerians and the Great Ones. They discovered that this stillborn child existed in an accessible nightmare realm, that its cry could be heard by those with sufficient insight, and that it represented an opportunity for direct communion. A living Great One might be too powerful or too alien to approach safely, but Murgo, trapped in its nightmare and crying out in loneliness or pain, seemed like a more feasible target for contact. Mikolash's ritual was designed to establish a connection with this crying child. The third umbilical cord served as a sort of phone line, a way to call across the boundaries between the waking world and the nightmare. By conducting the ritual under the light of the blood moon, which they themselves were beckoning closer, the scholars created conditions where such communication became possible. And crucially, by sending their own consciousness into the nightmare through their ritual, they ensured they would be present in the same space as Murgo, able to perceive and potentially communicate with the child directly. The ritual succeeded. The item description confirms that the cord granted Mensis audience with Murgo. But what did that audience entail? What did the scholars actually experience when they made contact with this stillborn Great One? The game never shows us this directly, but we can infer certain things from the results. The contact was profound enough to destroy the minds of almost everyone who participated. The stillbirth of their brains suggests that whatever knowledge or perception they received was fundamentally incompatible with human consciousness. Imagine trying to comprehend something utterly alien, a mode of existence so different from your own that it has no reference points in your experience. A Great One perceives reality in ways that have nothing to do with human senses or human thought processes. Their concerns, if they can be called that, operate on scales of time and space that make human lifetimes less than eye blinks. To have such a perspective suddenly flooding into a human mind, even one supposedly protected by a Mensis cage, would be like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. The mind simply couldn't contain it and shattered under the strain. But Mikolash survived, after a fashion. His consciousness remained intact enough to become the host of the nightmare, the anchoring point that held the nightmare of Mensis in existence. In this role, he became inseparably linked to Murgo's realm. The nightmare persisted because he persisted within it, wandering its halls and communing with forces beyond human comprehension. Whether Murgo itself was aware of Mikolash's presence, whether the Great One child recognized that this human was trying to connect with it, remains unclear. The child's giggle when the wet nurse is defeated might suggest some level of awareness, but it could just as easily be a reflexive sound, meaningless in human terms. The structure of the nightmare of Mensis reflects both the nature of nightmares in general and the specific character of Murgo's existence. It's a place of twisted architecture and impossible geometry, where buildings rise higher than they should and corridors lead to places that shouldn't exist. The denizens of this nightmare include malformed creatures, shambling horrors that were once scholars of Byrgenwerth, and the winter lanterns, those singing, brain-headed monstrosities whose very gaze causes frenzy. But the nightmare also contains Murgo's loft, a space that feels different from the rest. It's more structured, more purposeful, arranged like a cathedral or nursery. This is Murgo's domain, the space that the child's consciousness has shaped according to its own incomprehensible will. The path to reach it is long and winding, forcing visitors to ascend through multiple levels of the nightmare, almost like a pilgrimage to reach the sacred center. When hunters finally reach the wet nurse's lunarium and confront the guardian, they hear Murgo's cry clearly for the first time. It's a baby's wail, high-pitched and mournful, the sound of an infant in distress. For all its power, for all that it's a great one whose very existence warps reality, Murgo is still fundamentally a baby that never got to live. The tragedy of this situation stands in stark contrast to the horror of what Micolash did to reach it. The School of Mensis saw Murgo as an opportunity, a means to an end, a great one that could be contacted and used to gain knowledge. They never considered that this might be a child deserving of compassion, a being whose suffering might be real despite its alien nature. Their entire approach was exploitative, seeking to extract value from Murgo without any regard for the child itself. This attitude perfectly encapsulates the evil of Mikolash's philosophy. Everything and everyone is merely a tool to be used in pursuit of knowledge, stripped of any intrinsic worth beyond their utility. The fate of Murgo after the hunter defeats the wet nurse remains ambiguous. The cry stops, and the message "Nightmare Slain" appears, suggesting that something has ended. Some interpret this as Murgo finally being allowed to rest, released from whatever torment kept it crying in the nightmare. Others suggest that the nightmare persists, that we've merely silenced one aspect of it without fundamentally changing its nature. Queen Yharnam's bow to the hunter might indicate gratitude, a mother thanking someone for freeing her child from suffering. Or it might simply be acknowledgement that the cycle has continued, that another surrogate has been found or lost, that the endless tragedy of the Great One's inability to bear children continues. What's certain is that Murgo was a victim of the School of Mensis, just as surely as the residents of Yahar'gul and the prisoners in the Hypogean jail were victims. This stillborn child became the focus of Mikolash's obsession, drawn into his schemes without any agency or choice in the matter. The ritual that granted Mensis audience with Murgo may have caused the child additional suffering, may have intensified its crying and drawn it into an even more uncomfortable existence. We'll never know, because Mikolash and his followers never thought to consider such questions. They wanted knowledge, wanted transcendence, wanted to plant eyes on their brains, and Murgo was simply the means to achieve that goal. The atrocities, a catalogue of evil. The crimes of the School of Mensis are extensive and horrifying, a catalogue of atrocities that mark Mikolash as one of the most thoroughly evil characters in all of From Software's games. Unlike many villains whose evil stems from tragic circumstances or corrupting influences, Mikolash chose his path with full awareness of what it would cost. Each decision to kidnap another innocent, each experiment conducted on unwilling subjects, each step toward the Mensis Ritual was a deliberate choice made by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and proceeded anyway. The kidnapping operation alone represents a crime of staggering scope. For an extended period, agents of the School of Mensis, the hulking kidnappers with their distinctive sacks, roamed the streets of Yharnam, seizing citizens. These weren't targeted abductions of specific individuals who posed some threat to the school. These were random snatchings of anyone who happened to be vulnerable, who wandered into the wrong area at the wrong time, or who simply had the misfortune to be alone when a kidnapper was hunting. Consider the impact of this campaign on Yharnam's population. Dozens, possibly hundreds of people vanished from the streets over an extended period. Families woke to find loved ones missing with no explanation. Children waited for parents who never came home. Merchants expected regular customers who simply disappeared one night and were never seen again. The psychological toll on the community must have been immense, creating an atmosphere of fear and paranoia even before the beast scourge reached its peak. The Healing Church either couldn't or wouldn't stop the disappearances. Whether they were complicit, allowing the School of Mensis to operate because it was technically part of the church's upper echelons, or simply ineffective. Unable to protect their citizens from these predators, the result was the same. Yharnam's residents had no recourse, no protection. They could only hope they wouldn't be the next to vanish into the night. Once captured, victims were taken to the Hypogean jail, the underground prison that served as Yahar'gul's holding facility. Here they would be caged, kept in conditions that were barely survivable, until the scholars were ready to use them in their experiments. The psychological torture of this imprisonment, the knowledge that something terrible was coming without knowing exactly what or when, may have been as damaging as the physical experiments themselves. The experiments conducted on these prisoners varied in nature but shared a common thread. They were all designed to gather data for the School of Mensis's research, with no regard whatsoever for the welfare of the subjects. Some experiments focused on transformation, exposing subjects to massive quantities of old blood in attempts to forcibly evolve them into kin. The process was agonizing and almost always fatal, producing twisted, malformed creatures rather than the elevated beings the scholars hoped for. Other experiments were neurological in nature, attempts to artificially cultivate eyes on the brain, as Master Willem had described. This involved drilling into the skull while the subject was conscious, injecting various substances directly into the brain tissue, and observing the results as the subject screamed in agony. The goal was to force the development of enhanced perception, to give humans the ability to see and understand things that were normally beyond their capacity. The reality was that most subjects simply died or went insane, their brains unable to handle the trauma being inflicted upon them. The harvesting of body parts represented another category of atrocity. The School of Mensis needed raw materials for their rituals, organs and tissues that possessed specific properties or resonances. Eyes were particularly valued, gathered by the hundreds and stored in jars throughout Yahar'gul. But hearts, brains, spinal fluid, blood, all of these were harvested from living or recently deceased subjects and used in the school's ceremonial work. The treatment of these victims reveals much about how thoroughly Mikolash and his followers had abandoned their humanity. These were not anonymous test subjects or enemies of the state. These were ordinary people who had committed no crime except living in Yharnam. They had families, dreams, lives that were cut short because the School of Mensis decided they were more valuable as experimental materials than as human beings. And the scholars of Mensis conducted their experiments with clinical detachment, as evidenced by the notes found throughout Yahar'gul that discuss procedures without any acknowledgement of the suffering involved. But the individual crimes, as horrible as they were, pale in comparison to the ultimate atrocity: the Mensis Ritual itself and its consequences. When Mikolash finally conducted his grand ritual, he knew it would have catastrophic effects on the physical world. The notes make this clear. They understood that beckoning the blood moon would blur the line between man and beast, that it would intensify the scourge throughout Yharnam. They knew the ritual would affect everyone in Yahar'gul, transforming them in horrible ways or killing them outright. They proceeded anyway. Mikolash looked at an entire village, at all the people who lived there, including those who were not directly involved with the School of Mensis, and decided their lives were an acceptable price for the knowledge he sought. He sat in his chair, donned his elaborate Mensis cage, and led his followers into a ritual that would kill them all while devastating Yharnam in the process. The transformation of Yahar'gul's population represents perhaps the single most horrible result of the ritual. These weren't quick deaths. The victims weren't simply killed by the surge of eldritch energy. Instead, they were fused to the walls and buildings of the village, their bodies twisted and melted into impossible shapes while their minds remained at least partially aware of their condition. They're still technically alive when hunters arrive, these malformed sculptures of flesh and stone, reaching out with limbs that barely function, trapped in a state that might persist indefinitely. Imagine being one of those victims. You're going about your day in Yahar'gul, perhaps working in a shop or caring for your family. Suddenly, the blood moon blazes overhead with unprecedented intensity. You feel reality warping around you, feel your body beginning to change. You try to run, but your feet are already fusing to the cobblestones. You reach out for help, and your arm stretches impossibly long, the bones liquefying and reforming into something that's no longer quite an arm. The buildings around you seem to be reaching back, stone flowing like water, wrapping around your changing form. And then, you're stuck. You can't move, can't speak, can barely think through the agony and horror of your condition. You're aware enough to know that you're trapped, that you've been transformed into something that shouldn't exist, that you may remain like this forever. And all because some scholar you probably never met decided that his need for knowledge was more important than your life. That calculation, that willingness to sacrifice an entire village of people for an abstract goal, marks Mikolash as truly evil. This wasn't a mistake or an accident. It wasn't even collateral damage in pursuit of some arguably noble goal. It was a deliberate choice to prioritize his own desires over the lives and suffering of hundreds or thousands of other people. He knew what would happen, and he did it anyway. The broader impact of the ritual on Yharnam compounds this evil. By beckoning the blood moon closer, by thinning the barrier between the waking world and the nightmare, Mikolash intensified the beast scourge throughout the city. More people transformed into beasts. More hunters died trying to contain the outbreak. More families were torn apart by the curse that had always lurked in Yharnam's blood, but which now manifested with increased frequency and violence. How many deaths can be laid at Mikolash's feet? How many beast transformations occurred because he beckoned the blood moon? How many hunters fell in battle against creatures that wouldn't have transformed without his ritual's influence? The numbers are impossible to calculate, but they're certainly substantial. The Mensis Ritual didn't just destroy Yahar'gul. It contributed significantly to the catastrophe that engulfed all of Yharnam, pushing the city closer to the total collapse we witness in the game. And for what? What did Mikolash actually gain from all this suffering? He achieved communion with Murgo, yes, and that contact granted him some form of expanded perception. But it also destroyed his mind, trapped him in a nightmare, and ultimately left him as a mad, rambling figure who accomplishes nothing with the knowledge he gained. He's not a transcendent being. He's not a great one. He's just a broken man trapped in a dream, ranting about eyes and the cosmos while hunters chase him through endless corridors. The cost was literally everything: his life, his sanity, the lives of all his followers, the entire population of Yahar'gul, and significant portions of Yharnam's population. The benefit was knowledge that he can't meaningfully use and enlightenment that looks indistinguishable from madness. By any objective measure, the Mensis Ritual was a failure. But it was a failure that killed thousands and broke a city, all because one man refused to accept that some knowledge isn't worth the price of obtaining it. The One Reborn, monument to violation. Among the many horrors that emerged from the Mensis Ritual, few are as viscerally disturbing as the One Reborn, that massive amalgamation of corpses and eldritch power that hunters must confront in the Advent Plaza. This creature represents the physical manifestation of the ritual's consequences, a living monument to the School of Mensis's crimes. Understanding what the One Reborn is and how it came to be requires examining the ritual's effects on Yahar'gul and the role of the Thumerian chime maidens who served Mikolash's ambitions. The One Reborn appears as a towering mass of bodies, dozens or perhaps hundreds of corpses fused together into a single entity. Limbs protrude at impossible angles, multiple heads leer from various points on its body. The entire thing writhes and shifts, individual body parts moving independently even as the whole lurches forward. Looking at it evokes visceral revulsion, the instinctive human reaction to seeing the dead twisted into mockery of life. The creature's grotesque appearance suggests it may be composed of multiple individuals rather than a single being. The mass of bodies fused together, the multiple heads and limbs protruding at impossible angles, all point to a collective entity rather than a singular consciousness. This interpretation aligns with the visual design and theories about its origin, though the game never explicitly confirms the exact nature of what the One Reborn truly is. Most scholars of Bloodborne's lore believe that the One Reborn is composed of the victims of the Mensis Ritual, those who died in Yahar'gul as the blood moon blazed overhead. When Mikolash conducted his ritual, he called upon the chime maidens to perform a specific role. These ancient Thumerian women, remnants of that civilization which had first discovered the old blood, possessed abilities related to summoning and resurrection. They could call forth creatures from the nightmare realms, animate the dead, and channel eldritch energies in ways that few humans could match. Standing in the Advent Plaza, arranged around the perimeter where Mikolash and his scholars had conducted their ritual, The chime maidens rang their bells in unison. The sound resonated across the boundaries between worlds, calling out to something in the nightmare. And in response, the dead of Yahar'gul, all those who had perished in the ritual's power surge, began to move. Bodies that should have remained lifeless stirred, drawn together by forces that defied natural law. Like iron filings responding to a magnet, the corpses flowed toward the Advent Plaza. They climbed from the places where they had fallen, tore free from walls where they had been fused, dragged themselves across cobblestones with broken limbs. And as they converged, they merged, flesh fusing with flesh, bones intertwining, until the mass of individual dead became a single, massive entity. Whether the One Reborn possesses anything resembling consciousness is debatable. Does it think? Does it feel? Or is it merely a puppet, animated by the Chime Maiden's power, but lacking any true awareness? The creature's behavior suggests at least some rudimentary intelligence. It attacks deliberately rather than flailing randomly. It employs various techniques, including raining corpses from above and releasing torrents of noxious blood. But its actions might simply be programmed responses, reflexive behaviors encoded by whatever process brought it into being. Some theories propose that the One Reborn was meant to serve as a vessel for Murgo, an attempt to give the stillborn Great One a physical form in the waking world. This interpretation would explain why the creature appears in the Advent Plaza, the site of the ritual designed to contact Murgo. It would also explain the involvement of the Chime Maidens, who might have been following Mikolash's instructions to create a body capable of hosting a Great One's consciousness. However, this remains speculation, as the game never explicitly states the One Reborn's intended purpose. If this theory is correct, then the One Reborn represents a failure. Murgo's consciousness never transferred into this malformed vessel. The Great One remained in the nightmare, crying from its empty pram while its intended body shambled mindlessly through the Advent Plaza. This could explain why the ritual didn't progress far enough before the scholars' minds broke, or why Murgo might have rejected the grotesque form they had prepared, if it was even aware of the plan. Alternatively, housing a Great One's consciousness in a physical body may simply not be possible, and the One Reborn was doomed to be nothing more than an animated corpse pile from the moment of its creation. Alternatively, the One Reborn might not have been part of the original plan at all. It could be a side effect, an unintended consequence of the Chime Maiden's presence and the massive death toll in Yahar'gul. When so many died at once, in a place where the barrier between worlds had been deliberately thinned, something had to give. The accumulated death energy, or spiritual resonance, or whatever we call the remnant of so many lives ending simultaneously, needed an outlet. The One Reborn became that outlet, a spontaneous creation born from tragedy and eldritch power mixing in volatile ways. Fighting the One Reborn is a unique experience in Bloodborne. Unlike most bosses, you cannot meaningfully damage it while the Chime Maidens survive. They stand on balconies surrounding the Advent Plaza, continuing to ring their bells, and their power sustains the creature. Only by climbing to these balconies and killing each maiden individually can hunters weaken the One Reborn enough to destroy it. This mechanic reinforces the creature's nature as something maintained by external forces, rather than possessing independent existence. When the last Chime Maiden falls and the One Reborn finally collapses, its body doesn't simply disappear like most defeated enemies. It remains in the plaza, a massive pile of corpses that slowly begins to dissolve, the magical forces holding it together finally dissipating. The deaths that created it can finally rest, the individuals who were merged into this abomination released from their grotesque union. But the horror doesn't end with its defeat. Even with the One Reborn destroyed, Yahar'gul remains a charnel house. The people fused to the walls are still there, still trapped in their endless torment. The streets are still lined with the twisted remains of those who died in the ritual. The village that was hidden from view has become a monument to the School of Mensis's crimes, a place where the very architecture screams of suffering. The existence of the One Reborn adds another dimension to Mikolash's evil. This creature represents not just death, but the violation of death, the refusal to let the dead rest peacefully. Those who perished in the Mensis Ritual, who already died horribly as reality warped around them, were then further violated by being stitched together into this shambling monstrosity. They couldn't even have the dignity of remaining themselves in death, but instead were merged into a collective abomination, their individuality stripped away as thoroughly as their lives had been. This violation of the dead is particularly heinous because it serves no purpose beyond guarding the entrance to the nightmare of Mensis. The One Reborn doesn't advance the school's research. It doesn't facilitate communion with the Great Ones. It simply exists as an obstacle, a barrier to keep hunters from reaching Micolash. The people who composed it were transformed into a security measure, their deaths rendered even more meaningless by how their corpses were used. Meeting Micolash, the coward in the cage. When hunters finally reach the nightmare of Mensis and encounter Micolash directly, the experience is unlike any other boss fight in Bloodborne. There's no grand entrance, no dramatic cutscene revealing a terrible foe. Instead, you simply arrive in a corridor and see him standing there, a figure in tattered robes and a cage for a head, waiting almost casually. Then he runs, and the chase begins. This encounter perfectly captures Mikolash's character. He's not a warrior who stands and fights. He's a coward who flees, forcing others to pursue him through the labyrinthine corridors of the nightmare he created. The entire boss fight consists of chasing him through multiple levels, herding him toward rooms where he'll briefly stand and fight before fleeing again. It's frustrating, tedious, and deeply revealing of the man behind the cage. As hunters pursue him, Micolash talks constantly, calling out prayers and observations in a voice that wavers between fervent passion and manic glee. "Ah, Kos, or some say Kazum, do you hear our prayers?" he begins, addressing a great one who is long dead, killed by hunters in the fishing hamlet. "As you once did for the vacuous Rom, grant us eyes, plant eyes on our brains, to cleanse our beastly idiocy." These prayers reveal his obsession with the same goal that drove Master Willem, acquiring eyes, expanding perception, transcending the limitations of human consciousness. But where Willem sought this through patient study and contemplation, Micolash demands it be granted by divine intervention. He wants the Great Ones to simply bestow enlightenment upon him, as if he's earned it through his atrocities. His other dialogue is equally illuminating, majestic. "A hunter is a hunter, even in a dream," he exclaims when reduced to half health, showing genuine appreciation for being challenged. There's almost admiration in his voice, recognition that the hunter pursuing him is worthy in some way. It's a moment of lucidity in his madness, an acknowledgement that even in this realm where he should have complete control, he's not truly supreme. Later, he muses. The nightmare swirls and churns unending. It's unclear whether this is complaint or celebration. Is he lamenting that he's trapped in an endless cycle, or exulting in the infinite possibilities of the nightmare? The ambiguity is probably intentional. Micolash himself may not know how he feels about his situation, caught between satisfaction at having achieved communion with the Great Ones and the growing realization that the price might have been too high. His final moments are perhaps most telling. When the hunter delivers the killing blow, Mikolash's consciousness begins to fade. His last words are, "Now I'm waking up, I'll forget everything." Or in some translations, "Will I wake up? Will I forget everything?" After all his effort, all his sacrifice, all the horrors he inflicted in pursuit of knowledge, he faces the possibility that death in the nightmare means true death, and that all the insight he gained will vanish with him. There's no triumph in his voice during these final words, no sense that he's achieved something worthwhile. Instead, there's uncertainty, possibly even fear. He spent so long convinced that enlightenment would be worth any price, but in his last conscious moments, doubt creeps in. What if he's wrong? What if the knowledge he gained means nothing? What if his entire quest was futile? The nightmare itself serves as an extension of Mikolash's psychology. It's a place of corridors and staircases, of paths that double back on themselves, of rooms that connect in ways that violate normal geometry. Hunters can see Micolash running on a level below or above, can hear his voice echoing from multiple directions at once. The architecture reflects his mental state, confused, fragmented, circling endlessly around the same obsessions without ever truly progressing. Within the nightmare, Micolash commands certain powers. He can teleport through mirrors, vanishing from one location and reappearing in another. He can summon skeletal puppets to fight alongside him, though these creatures are weak and easily destroyed. And most dangerously, he can use hunter tools, specifically the Augur of Ebrietas and a Call Beyond. These arcane abilities, requiring significant insight to use effectively, demonstrate that he has indeed gained supernatural knowledge from his communion with the Great Ones. The Augur of Ebrietas manifests as a burst of tentacles erupting from his extended hand, a grotesque display of eldritch power made physical. A Call Beyond is even more spectacular, creating a burst of star-like projectiles that spread outward in all directions, capable of killing hunters instantly if they all connect. These abilities prove that Micolash did achieve something through his ritual, that he gained powers beyond normal human limits. But these powers don't save him. A determined hunter will eventually corner him, will reduce his health to nothing, will end his existence in the nightmare. And for all his supernatural abilities, for all the knowledge he gained, Micolash dies like anyone else, his form dissipating as his consciousness finally ceases. The powers he gained were ultimately insufficient to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. The encounter with Micolash is deliberately designed to be frustrating. Players must chase him through confusing corridors, must figure out the trick to herding him toward the right rooms, must deal with his attacks while navigating the nightmare's geometry. Many players find this boss fight more annoying than challenging, and that's probably intentional. From Software wants players to feel the tedium of pursuing this man through his own twisted realm, to experience the frustration of dealing with someone who won't stand and face the consequences of his actions. But there's also something deeply pathetic about Micolash. He's not a towering demon or a terrible beast. He's just a man in a cage, running through corridors, calling out prayers that no one answers. He achieved communion with the Great Ones, but it didn't make him great. It just made him mad. He created the nightmare of Mensis, but he's trapped within it, unable to leave or even truly control what he's made. He gained eyes on the inside, but all they let him see is his own failure endlessly reflected back at him. When hunters finally kill him, there's often not a sense of victory, but rather a sense of ending something that should have ended long ago. Micolash has been trapped in this nightmare since the Mensis Ritual, his body long dead in the waking world, his consciousness preserved only by the nightmare's strange properties. Killing him is almost a mercy, releasing him from an existence that might have stretched on indefinitely if not for the hunter's intervention. But even in death, Micolash leaves consequences. The nightmare of Mensis persists after his defeat. Whatever he created or unleashed by hosting the nightmare continues to exist independent of him. And in the waking world, the ruins of Yahar'gul stand as permanent testimony to his crimes, a place where the very stones remember the suffering he caused. Why Micolash is Bloodborne's most evil. Throughout Bloodborne's dark narrative, we encounter many characters who commit terrible acts. Father Gascoigne succumbs to the beast and likely kills his own wife. The Healing Church experiments on orphans and distributes the poisoned blood that creates the scourge. The hunters of the Healing Church massacre the residents of the fishing hamlet. Master Willem, for all his wisdom, orders actions that lead to immense suffering. Each of these characters or institutions bears responsibility for significant evil. Yet Micolash, host of the nightmare, stands apart from all of them as the single most evil character in the game. This distinction is not about body count, though his is substantial. Nor is it primarily about the nature of his crimes, though they are horrific. Rather, what makes Micolash uniquely evil is the combination of knowledge, choice, and lack of remorse that characterizes his actions. Consider Father Gascoigne. He transforms into a beast and commits murder, but his transformation strips away his human consciousness. He becomes an animal, acting on instinct rather than choice. The man who was Gascoigne wouldn't have killed his wife. The beast wearing his face does. There's tragedy in this, but calling it evil in the fullest sense requires that we hold someone responsible for actions they couldn't control. The Healing Church as an institution is certainly evil in many ways. It experiments on vulnerable populations, covers up the true nature of the blood ministration, and pursues power at the expense of the people it claims to serve. But institutions are composed of many individuals, each with different levels of knowledge and agency. Many church members genuinely believe they're helping people. Many are simply following orders or maintaining systems they didn't create. While the institution bears collective guilt, no single person within it approaches Mikolash's level of deliberate, informed evil. Master Willem ordered the massacre at the fishing hamlet, a crime that brought a terrible curse upon the hunters and continues to cause suffering through the hunter's nightmare. This is certainly evil, but Willem seemed to believe that the knowledge gained from studying Kaz's corpse would benefit all humanity. He was wrong, tragically so, but at least he was pursuing what he believed was a greater good. Mikolash had no such justification. His goal was his own enlightenment, his own communion with the Great Ones, with others' welfare never entering his calculations. What makes Mikolash most evil is the deliberate nature of his crimes. He knew exactly what he was doing at every stage. When he ordered the kidnapping of Yharnam residents, he knew they would suffer and die in his experiments. When he prepared the Mensis Ritual, he knew it would kill everyone in Yahar'gul and intensify the beast scourge throughout Yharnam. When he called the blood moon closer, he knew it would blur the line between man and beast, causing countless transformations and deaths. At every step, he had complete information about the consequences of his actions and chose to proceed anyway. There was no ignorance, no confusion, no tragic mistake, just cold calculation that weighed human lives against abstract knowledge and found the lives worthless in comparison. Moreover, Mikolash had opportunities to stop. The School of Mensis operated for an extended period before the final ritual. During that time, he must have seen the results of his experiments, seen how many people died screaming without yielding useful data, seen how rarely his procedures produced anything resembling the transcendence he sought. Each failed experiment was an opportunity to reconsider, to question whether this path was truly leading anywhere worthwhile. He could have released his prisoners, could have ended the kidnapping operations, could have disbanded the School of Mensis and pursued less destructive avenues of research. He had agency, capability, and opportunity to choose differently. He simply didn't want to. His desire for knowledge, his ambition to commune with the Great Ones, was more important to him than the suffering he caused. This is the essence of evil, the deliberate choice to prioritize one's own desires over others' welfare, made with full knowledge of the harm being inflicted. Mikolash exemplifies this completely. He looked at the suffering he was causing and found it acceptable. He looked at the lives he would destroy through the ritual and deemed them expendable. He looked at the possibility that his entire enterprise might be futile and decided to proceed anyway, rather than admit he might be wrong. Even when we encounter him in the nightmare, after his physical body has died and his consciousness has been transformed by communion with Mergo, he shows no sign of remorse or regret. He doesn't lament the lives lost or the suffering caused. He doesn't question whether the knowledge he gained was worth the price. Instead, he continues to praise the Great Ones, to seek more insight, to pursue the same goals that led to such catastrophe. His last words express only concern that he might forget what he's learned, not sorrow for what he's done. This lack of remorse is crucial to understanding his evil. Many characters in fiction commit terrible acts, but later recognize their mistakes and feel genuine guilt. This remorse, while it doesn't undo the harm, at least demonstrates some remaining humanity, some capacity for moral growth. Mikolash demonstrates no such capacity. His moral sense, if he ever possessed one, has been completely overwritten by his obsession with enlightenment. In the context of Bloodborne's themes, Mikolash also represents a cautionary tale about the pursuit of knowledge without wisdom. The game repeatedly suggests that seeking truth can be dangerous, that some knowledge is genuinely harmful to possess. But the danger doesn't lie in the knowledge itself so much as in the methods used to acquire it and the uses to which it's put. Knowledge pursued without moral constraints, without regard for the welfare of others, becomes not enlightenment, but corruption. Mikolash pursued knowledge as an end in itself, without considering whether the knowledge was worth having, or whether the methods he employed were justified. He achieved communion with the Great Ones, gained eyes on the inside, perceived truths beyond normal human comprehension. And what did any of it accomplish? He became a mad, rambling figure trapped in a nightmare, unable to meaningfully use the knowledge he gained, unable even to properly die. His entire quest was ultimately pointless, achieving nothing but destruction. This pointlessness compounds his evil. At least if his actions had led to some benefit, some advancement for humanity or genuine transcendence, we might understand, if not forgive, his methods. But he accomplished nothing. The knowledge he gained drove him mad. The ritual destroyed Yahar'gul and intensified the beast scourge without producing any offsetting benefit. The School of Mensis was annihilated, its research lost, its goals permanently out of reach. All the suffering Micolash caused was for nothing. Every person who died screaming in his experiments, every resident of Yahar'gul fused to the walls, every victim of the intensified beast scourge that his ritual enabled, they all died pointlessly. Their sacrifice achieved nothing because there was nothing to achieve. Micolash was chasing an illusion, convinced that communion with the Great Ones would grant him something valuable, when in reality, it only destroyed everything it touched. Standing in the nightmare of Mensis, listening to Micolash's rambling prayers as you chase him through corridors that make no geometric sense, you witness the final state of a man who sacrificed everything, including his own humanity, in pursuit of a goal that was never worth pursuing. He achieved communion with the Great Ones, and it broke him. He gained eyes on the inside, and they showed him nothing but his own failure reflected infinitely back at himself. This is why Micolash stands as Bloodborne's most evil character. Not because he killed the most people or caused the most obvious destruction, but because he represents the purest form of evil, the deliberate, informed choice to cause suffering in pursuit of selfish goals, made without remorse and maintained without possibility of redemption. He looked into the abyss and decided to drag everyone else in with him. And when the abyss looked back and showed him the horror of what he'd become, he called it enlightenment and asked for more. The lore of Bloodborne is mesmerizing in its complexity, in the way it weaves together themes of ambition, knowledge, suffering, and the terrible costs of pursuing transcendence. And at the dark heart of that lore sits Micolash, host of the nightmare, a monument to what happens when intelligence operates without conscience, when ambition strips away all moral restraint, when the pursuit of knowledge becomes an end that justifies any means. His legacy is destruction. A village consumed, a city brought to the brink of collapse, countless lives ended or ruined, and a nightmare that will persist long after his own consciousness finally fades. In a game full of tragic figures and morally compromised characters, Micolash stands alone as someone who cannot be understood or forgiven, whose actions demand condemnation without qualification. The cage on his head, that iron framework meant to protect his mind and facilitate communion with higher beings, becomes a perfect symbol for his character. He imprisoned himself, constrained his own perception in pursuit of expanded consciousness, and achieved only a different form of blindness. The cage that was meant to grant him eyes instead left him unable to see the most important truth of all, that knowledge without wisdom is worse than ignorance, and that no insight is worth the price of one's humanity. When we defeat Micolash and his consciousness finally dissipates into the nightmare, we end not a life, but a lingering mistake, an error in reality that should have been corrected long ago. His death is not tragic. It's necessary, overdue, a small measure of justice for the countless victims whose names we'll never know and whose suffering we can only imagine. The nightmare may persist, but at least its host can no longer actively cause harm. Yet even in death, Micolash's influence remains. The structures he built, both physical and metaphysical, continue to shape the world. The knowledge he pursued still tempts other scholars who might follow his path. The example he set, of ambition unrestrained by ethics, serves as both warning and inspiration to those who come after. His evil has a kind of permanence that transcends his individual existence. This is perhaps the final horror of Micolash's story. That evil of this magnitude doesn't simply disappear when its perpetrator dies. It echoes forward through time, creating ripples that touch people who never knew the original villain, who suffer consequences without understanding their origin. The residents of Yharnam will deal with the aftermath of the Mensis Ritual for generations, if any generations remain. The nightmare he helped create will trap and torment souls long after the last person who remembers his name has turned to dust. And somewhere in the cosmic scope of Bloodborne's universe, in the incomprehensible awareness of the Great Ones he so desperately sought to join, Mikolash's entire life, all his crimes and ambitions, all the suffering he caused and the goals he pursued, amount to less than nothing. The great ones, if they noticed him at all, saw him as humans might notice a mayfly, a brief flicker of existence too insignificant to warrant attention. He sacrificed everything to matter to beings who would never care, and in doing so, he abandoned any possibility of mattering to the beings who actually could have cared, his fellow humans. This is the ultimate futility of his evil. He destroyed so much in pursuit of recognition from entities that were fundamentally incapable of recognizing him in any way that would satisfy his desire for significance. He could have achieved genuine significance through kindness, through using his considerable intellect to help others, through making the world better rather than worse. Instead, he chose a path that guaranteed his legacy would be one of horror, that his name would be remembered only as a cautionary tale, an example of how thoroughly a human being can fail at the basic task of being human. So when we ask why Mikolash stands as Bloodborne's most evil character, the answer lies not in any single atrocity, but in the totality of his choices and their consequences. He had knowledge, and used it to harm. He had power, and wielded it without restraint. He had opportunities to choose differently, and rejected them all. He achieved his goals, and they were revealed as hollow. And through it all, from the first prisoner dragged to Yahar'gul to his final moments in the nightmare, he showed no recognition that he might be wrong, no capacity for growth or redemption, no spark of the humanity he so eagerly abandoned. In a game about the beast within, about the struggle to maintain humanity in the face of forces that seek to strip it away, Mikolash represents the most dangerous beast of all, the human who willingly surrenders his humanity while maintaining the appearance and intellect of a man. He became a monster, not through transformation or curse, but through choice. And that choice makes him irredeemable in ways that even the most terrible beasts are not. The lore of Bloodborne is mesmerizing precisely because it presents these kinds of characters, these explorations of what evil truly means when stripped of simple explanations and obvious excuses. And in that rogues gallery of the damned and the fallen, Mikolash, host of the nightmare, stands supreme in his terribleness, a reminder that the worst monsters are often those who claim they're pursuing enlightenment. If you found this deep dive into Mikolash's character and crimes compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more Bloodborne lore to explore, from the tragedy of Lady Maria to the cosmic horror of the fishing hamlet, to the intricate web of connections between all of Yharnam's factions. Each story reveals new layers of this incredible game's narrative. What do you think? Does Mikolash deserve the title of Bloodborne's most evil character, or do you think another figure bears that distinction? Let me know in the comments below, and if you have suggestions for other Bloodborne characters or locations you'd like to see examined in depth, drop those in the comments as well. Until next time, may you find your worth in the waking world, and may you fear the old blood. A final reflection on evil and knowledge. The story of Mikolash forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the pursuit of knowledge. In many ways, he represents an extreme version of tendencies that exist in less dramatic forms throughout human history. The willingness to sacrifice others for abstract goals. The conviction that one's own quest for understanding justifies any means. The inability to recognize when ambition has crossed the line into monstrosity. What makes his story particularly chilling is how easily we can trace the path from legitimate scholarly inquiry to unspeakable atrocity. Mikolash didn't start out as a monster. He was a student at Byrgenwerth, part of an institution dedicated to expanding human knowledge and understanding. He studied under Master Willem, learned the importance of insight and perception, absorbed teachings about transcending human limitations. These are not inherently evil goals. The desire to understand the universe, to perceive truth, to elevate human consciousness, these are aspirations that have driven some of humanity's greatest achievements. But somewhere along the way, Mikolash lost sight of why these goals matter. He forgot that knowledge should serve humanity, not the other way around. He convinced himself that understanding was more valuable than compassion, that insight was more important than empathy, that transcendence justified any sacrifice. And once he made that fundamental error, once he placed abstract knowledge above concrete human welfare, The rest followed with terrible inevitability. This is the real lesson of Mikolash's story. Evil doesn't always announce itself with grand declarations and obvious villainy. Sometimes it comes disguised as enlightenment, wrapped in the language of progress and discovery. Sometimes the most dangerous people are those who believe they're pursuing noble goals, who have convinced themselves that their quest is so important that normal moral considerations don't apply. Mikolash stands as a warning to anyone who pursues knowledge. Not a warning against seeking understanding, but a warning about what happens when that pursuit becomes unmoored from ethical grounding. Knowledge without wisdom leads to disaster. Intelligence without compassion produces monstrosity. And ambition without moral constraint creates nightmares, both literal and metaphorical, that can consume entire cities. The scholars of Byrgenwerth, the researchers of the healing church, the hunters who committed atrocities in pursuit of their goals, they all failed in different ways. But Mikolash's failure is perhaps the most complete, because he had every opportunity to choose differently and rejected them all. He saw the suffering his methods caused and continued anyway. He witnessed the failure of his experiments and pressed on regardless. He stood at the threshold of the Mensis Ritual, knowing it would destroy Yahar'gul, and conducted it without hesitation. That is the face of true evil, not the passionate monster who loses control, not the tragic figure corrupted by external forces, but the cold, calculating mind that weighs lives against knowledge and finds the lives wanting. Mikolash reminds us that the worst horrors are often perpetrated by people who believe they're doing something important, who have rationalized away their guilt, who have constructed elaborate justifications for actions that should be obviously wrong. In the end, Mikolash achieved his goal. He gained audience with Murgo. He obtained the knowledge he sought. He expanded his perception beyond normal human limits, and it destroyed him utterly, leaving him as a mad wraith trapped in a nightmare of his own creation, ranting prayers to gods who will never answer. His story is a tragedy, but not the kind that evokes sympathy. It's a tragedy of wasted potential, of intelligence perverted to terrible ends, of a mind that could have contributed so much good to the world but instead chose to leave only suffering in its wake.